We're not talking about the possibility in the abstract of climate change causing conflicts. We're talking about regions where conflicts exist, have been on fire for decades in some cases, but are likely to get much, much worse due to resource scarcity, conflicts over water, and all the instability and political governance issues which flow out of that. As states are unable to meet the needs of their people, they become delegitimized, radicals take hold, and our security challenges become magnified. In the future, though, in terms of specific climate work, we're going to be doing smaller, more narrowly focused projects about how the U.S. military is dealing with the challenge in terms of infrastructure and basing, the potential of working with allies, because one major strand of ASP's agenda is promote more multilateralism in American foreign policy. And here's a case where both in terms of working through broad multilateral organizations like the G-20, but also in all sorts of bilateral kinds of settings, there's lots of room for cooperative efforts to either green American foreign policy, to find ways to mitigate some of the consequences, or find ways for especially developing nations to adapt to some of the real negative consequences which were already sort of locked in by virtue of our failure to act sooner on climate change. On September 10th, we did a large conference with our partners at George Washington University called The Day Before, where we talked about essentially the fact that what climate scientists are giving us is a warning. In the same way that President Bush received a warning, Al-Qaeda plans to attack the United States. He received that in August of 2001. Well, the IPCC report is a similar analogous kind of warning to us, to the national security community. We make this argument and we get a lot of traction. People find this interesting and compelling. Clearly, if you look at the public opinion polling, it is a significant factor in making people more willing to accept perhaps higher energy costs that they might face in their daily lives, because they understand national security consequences of it. Nevertheless, it's just one part of a puzzle in terms of policymakers, as far as we can talk when we talk to them, especially in Congress. They're concerned about the national security consequences, but they're also concerned about jobs in their own districts. They're concerned about the pressure they're under from both advocates of climate change legislation and those who are opposed to it. So they're engaged in a tough balancing act, and all we're doing is providing one piece of the puzzle, and we're providing it from perspective of a nonpartisan organization, not environmental advocates, but just people concerned with security, who are trying to make sure that those are taken into account in decisions.
I think it's very important at this time that as the G20 meets, we bear in mind that there are millions and millions of children in Africa that are unable to go to school, millions of children that are dying from very preventable diseases. It is estimated that by the end of this year, 4.8 million children are going to die from starvation in sub-Saharan Africa alone, excluding the northern part of Africa. So we are calling on the G20 to strongly consider cancelling these odious dates, those countries that come from the Paris Club Consortium, and even as we know that they have a lot of authority over the IMF and the World Bank.
So what we definitely need is the political willingness for these leaders to act. They honor their aid commitments and ensure that what is needed to save life in the developing countries is done. As we have said before, $18 billion were mobilized to bail out the banks, but over the past 50 years, only $2 billion was provided for development. So it is not an issue of resources. It is an issue of political willingness to act. Thank you. How can we ensure that Africa or the poor nations have a voice, which is what the UN Financial Conference tried to address? Because, again, going back to what Nancy had said, in the G20, the poor nations don't have a voice. But then the UN provided that platform or that forum for the poor nations to be able to have a voice. And also this is why there is call for a reform of the governance structure of the international financial institutions, so that the poor people would have a voice and also on decision-making issues.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to use this opportunity to just give you a sense of where civil society campaigning is with regard to Copenhagen. We understand the moment of history that we find ourselves in is a particularly urgent, challenging one, that we have to, as on the one hand we say to governments and business, it cannot be business as usual. On our end of the bargain, we also have been saying it cannot be business as usual. So we have been trying to build a very large, broad alliance of trade unions, NGOs, religious groups in several countries around the world, together with well-known international development and environmental NGOs like WWF, Greenpeace, Oxfam, and so on, Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum, and several other organizations as well. We have begun to roll out campaigning activities to put pressure on governments at the national level, so that in the first instance pushing governments and heads of state to commit to themselves being in Copenhagen, and beyond that to ensure that the demands of a fair, ambitious and binding deal is still a possibility. And we've been somewhat tongue-in-cheek saying we want a FAB deal, meaning fair, ambitious and binding. So we want a deal, though, that has the right kind of ambition, not something that is simply a step in the right direction, which is progress, but does not deliver what we want. And can I just quickly say that there is a line that is being repeatedly used by certain people in government, which was used by Tony Blair when we launched Climate Week the other day in New York, where he said we should make sure that perfect is not the enemy of the good, meaning that in search for a perfect deal, we should not be critical of some good things that might happen. And we are way beyond perfect. When we got a situation, perfect is just not a possibility when we know that already in Papua New Guinea, for example, we had a climate witness brought here by the Tick 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 campaign who tells a story about all they need right now is assistance to actually be moved off their island because it's finished. There's no chance of actually saving it. We have to say, yes, we can, yes, we must, and yet is that this, yes, we can is no longer good enough. We have to say, yes, we can, yes, we must, and yes, we will, because if we don't do that, all the talk about Copenhagen becoming Hopenhagen will simply be a Floppenhagen. Thank you very much. Its failure to act now in terms of costs will be exponentially more by every year of delay. And here in the United States you've got a a horrific example of Hurricane Katrina. A failure to invest millions in upgrading the levees led to the human devastation that we saw, and billions needed to actually rebuild. So the one message that we have to get through, and citizens need to be making to their governments, is the cost of not acting is much, much more than the cost of acting now.
Meeting. We are now headed to Copenhagen in 2.5 or so months' time. And what needs to emerge in many ways from the leaders here is a clear commitment, a sense of energy and purpose on our way to Copenhagen. The negotiations in Copenhagen will focus on financing in 2 key areas: mitigation, that is to say, reduction of emissions through clean energy technologies, and also by reducing deforestation.